Today's discussion will be the history of accessibility. The first nationally recognized accessibility design standard is the ANSI, A-N-S-I, A117.1, Accessible and Usable Buildings and Facilities. It was first published by the American National Standards Institute in 1961. It is the technical standards for accessible features. You will find them referenced in the International Building Code and the Fair Housing Accessibility Guidelines, among others. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed. It made racial discrimination in public places illegal. It required employers to provide equal opportunities, and it included establishing uniform standards for voting rights. The Architectural Barriers Act, also known as ABA, was passed in 1968. It requires facilities designed, constructed, altered, or leased with certain federal funds to be accessible to persons with disabilities. The 1973 Rehabilitation Act prohibits discrimination based on a disability in programs conducted by federal agencies, in programs receiving federal financial assistance, in any federal employment, and the employment practices of federal contractors. The Rehabilitation Act includes sections 504 and 508, which covers agencies receiving federal aid. The requirements include reasonable accommodations for employees with disability, program accessibility, effective communications with people who have hearing and vision disabilities, and accessible new construction and alterations. In 1984, the Uniform Federal Accessibility Standards were published. They contain the accessibility scoping and technical requirements for implementing the Architectural Barriers Act of 1968. The Federal Fair Housing Amendments Act, passed in 1988, addresses multifamily housing. It requires buildings with 4 or more covered dwelling units contain adaptable features. The Americans with Disabilities Act, passed in 1990. It prohibits discrimination based on disabilities and established design guidelines for new construction and alterations of facilities required to be accessible. It covers private sectors, public accommodations, and commercial facilities. It also covers public sector, local and state government facilities. ADA is comprised of 5 titles. Title I, Access to the Workplace. Title II, State and Local Government Services. Title III, Places of Public Accommodation and Commercial Facilities. Title IV, Telecommunication. And Title V, Miscellaneous Federal Agencies that enforce law. Fair Housing Accessibility Guidelines was introduced in 1991. It spells out the minimum scoping and technical requirements to comply with the Fair Housing Amendments Act. The Fair Housing Act Design Manual, updated in 1998, contains 7 requirements to consider in the design and construction of multifamily housing covered by the Act. 1 is accessible entrance on an accessible route. 2, accessible and usable public and common use areas. 3, usable doors. 4, accessible route into and through a covered unit. 5, switches, outlets, thermostats, and other environmental controls in accessible location. Number 6, reinforced walls for grab bars. And number 7, usable kitchens and bathrooms. The Department of Justice adopted the 1991 Americans with Disabilities Act Standards for Accessible Design. That contains accessibility, scoping, and technical requirements to implement the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. The DOJ also adopted the Americans with Disabilities Act Architectural Guidelines as its standard for ADA Title III new construction and alterations. The ADA accessibility guidelines have been amended to include guidelines for 1998 state and local government facilities, 2000 play areas, 2002 recreation facilities, 2002 Help America Vote Act, 2003 Equal Opportunity Commission Management Directive 715. In 2004, ADA and ABA accessibility guidelines for buildings and facilities was updated and last published in the Federal Register on May 7, 2014. In 2005, the United States Postal Service adopted Standards for Facility Accessibility, which contains accessibility scoping and technical requirements implementing the Architectural Barriers Act of 1968. In 2006, the U.S. General Services Administration adopted the Architectural Barriers Act Accessibility Standards containing accessibility scoping and technical requirements implementing the Architectural Barriers Act of 1968. In 2006, the Department of Transportation adopted the ADA Standards for Transportation Facilities. It contains the scoping and technical requirements to implement ADA. In 2008, the Department of Defense adopted the ABA Accessibility Standards for Department of Defense. It contains accessibility scoping and technical requirements implementing the Architectural Barriers Act of 1968. In 2010, the Department of Justice updated the ADA Standards for Accessible Design, the scoping and technical requirements to implement ADA for all covered facilities except transportation facilities. When we talk about multifamily and the role of ADA for accessibility, we're speaking about the leasing center, site arrival points, accessible parking and an accessible route, an accessible building entrance, an accessible route into and through the accessible building, drinking fountains, telephones, and toilet facilities. The role of FHA in terms of multifamily accessibility is more specific. It requires 7 design features to be met for multifamily housing to comply with the Fair Housing Act. Those features include accessible building entrance on an accessible route, accessible and usable public and common use areas, usable doors, accessible route into and through a covered unit, outlets, switches, thermostats, and other environmental controls in accessible locations, blocking for grab bars, and usable kitchens and bathrooms. When we talk about ADA for multifamily, we're really talking about accessibility for multifamily. ADA covers public accommodations and commercial facilities. FHA addresses covered multifamily dwelling units and facilities. When addressing accessibility compliance for multifamily, both ADA and FHA must be consulted. We'll start the series with ADA for multifamily, and then moved to FHA for multifamily. Please check back in to continue my series on accessibility for multifamily.